The rolling tide of both medical and adult use cannabis legalization across the United States has continued to make waves for operators, consumers, and investors. As existing companies expand into newly legal states and brand new companies are formed from the ground up, there has been a proliferation of opportunities for investors that want to dive into the US cannabis market. Like any other sector, investors do best when they have the best information. And on today's episode, we will be chatting with financial consultant and deep dive contributor Michael Miller about a little known resource that investors can tap into to get leading information on some of America's largest and fastest growing multi-state cannabis operators. But before we get into it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Hey Michael, welcome to The Dive.
Hey, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right. How about yourself?
Very well, thank you.
Okay, so before we dive into how MSO investors can get an information edge, let's take a step back and answer a question that some of the first-time or newer MSO investors might be wondering. Why are all these large American multi-state cannabis operators listed in Canada? Why aren't they listed on the NASDAQ, New York Stock Exchange, or another larger American exchange where there are more active investors and more liquidity?
So thank you for that. So the first thing to remember is that you have to consider is the federal status of cannabis in the United States. Cannabis has been legalized in many states at the state level. However, federally, it remains illegal. And now the issue here is that the largest American exchanges, New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, these are all regulated by the federal government. And those exchanges are not willing to list companies that are participating in these activities at this time. That doesn't mean, though, that they're not willing to list cannabis companies that are operating in a fully legal capacity in other jurisdictions. So, for example, Tilray Cannabis is operating fully legally in Canada. They have some hemp operations in the United States that are fully legal, and they're allowed to list in the United States. We've seen companies like Canopy and Aurora have also listed in the United States because their activities are considered fully legal. So it's a bit of a quirk at this time that these companies can't list in the United States for now, which is why they're kind of moving over to Canada.
So you explained why these companies currently cannot list in the United States due to its federal illegal status. However, why are the Canadian stock exchanges okay with it? Is it because cannabis is legal for medical and adult use across all of Canada?
So this is a bit of a popular misconception that all Canadian exchanges are comfortable with the idea of hosting American cannabis companies. At the end of the day, the activities of these American cannabis companies are still illegal in the country in which they are operating, and our exchanges take that into consideration. So the best example of this is the Toronto Stock Exchange, which is the largest stock exchange in Canada. The Toronto Stock Exchange, back in the very early days of cannabis and companies going public, used to kind of be turning a blind eye, or maybe it just wasn't on their radar. And they were actually okay with American companies, or rather Canadian companies with American assets being on the exchange. However, they had a review in October 2017. They decided, look, this isn't for us. We're not interested in it. Many of the people who sit on the board of the Toronto Stock Exchange are actually quite conservative. And they said, we don't want to take on the risk of irritating our American counterparts. And so they said, nope, we're not going to tolerate that. So some Canadian companies that were actually dabbling in the American space, for example, Aurora and Afria, actually had to divest those assets if they wanted to keep on the exchange. And that's exactly what they did, that they divested them or they spun them off. There's some companies such as Canopy, which were able to retain some US interests, for example, their stake in TerraSen through some legal maneuvering. But for the most part, the TSX is completely off limits for American cannabis operators. With that in mind, though, we have other exchanges in Canada, and the one that most MSO investors have probably heard of, it's called the Canadian Securities Exchange. And the Canadian Securities Exchange is a younger exchange. They're more willing to engage in, I don't want to say engage in risk, but they're more willing to have a broader risk profile when it comes to the companies they host. So a lot of American cannabis companies have found that the Canadian Securities Exchange has been very accommodating and willing to host them, even though the TSX, the Toronto Stock Exchange, has been unwilling to do so.
So most investors in public companies are familiar with the idea that listed companies need to file certain documents and make them available to the public as a condition for their listing. For example, quarterly financial statements need to be uploaded in Canada to CEDAR and in the United States to EDGAR. When it comes to getting a leading edge on information about MSOs, are you referring to those documents or another source of information entirely?
So as you said, when you're a public company, you're required to file certain documents with a certain degree of frequency. So for example, you have to file quarterly financial statements. You have to disclose details of your executive compensation. if you've entered into a major material contract or a credit agreement, you have to upload that information. But some investors don't realize that it's not just those documents that you might have to upload. Depending on what exchange you're on, certain exchanges demand you file additional documents or have enhanced disclosure that goes beyond the scope of those more conventional documents that we're used to reading all the time. And the Canadian Securities Exchange, which hosts the overwhelming majority of the MSOs, is one of those unique exchanges that requires people to file additional routine forms with the exchange. And the big one that we want to talk about today is something called a Form 7 monthly progress report. And this is a source of leading information where if you're an MSO investor, you can get a great source of information before some of these more conventional documents come out.
Well, let's unpack that a bit. Let's start with what this monthly progress report is exactly and why it can be so useful to investors.
Sure. So if you're listed on the Canadian Securities Exchange, they require you to file this form every single month. And you're supposed to file it before the 5th trading day of the month. So for example, this past March 1st was a Monday, March 5th was Friday, we had no holidays in between. So your form was due the morning of March 5th before trading opened. In this month in May, May 1st, was a Saturday. So we had 1st and 2nd, there was no trading, but on May 7th, it was a Friday. So you had to file the form before that time. And what this form does is that it gives the company a bunch of questions they have to answer about customer gains and losses, new business operations, product launches, hiring and firing of employees. And what makes these forms so unique is the fact that we have these quarterly documents that we have to expect, for example, quarterly financial statements. But then this additional form comes out, which can give you a leading edge in terms of what's going to happen in those quarterly statements. For example, you might see big shifts in customer gains, customer losses that isn't normally press released by the company, but nonetheless has to be reported on this form that you can take a look at.
So if I was an investor looking for this monthly progress report, where would I find it? Would I find it on CEDAR, the Canadian repository for public findings, or would I find it on EDGAR, the American one? Or would I look somewhere else entirely?
So the big thing is that these forms are not filed on CEDAR or they're not filed on EDGAR. They're actually filed on the CSE's website itself. And we'll do a little illustrative example to show people how they can actually find these forms. So the first thing you want to do when you want to look for a monthly progress report from a company that's listed on the Canadian Securities Exchange is you want to go to the CSE's website, and the URL is just the CSE.com. And say, for example, we'll use the example of Trulieve, which is a very, very large American cannabis operator based in Florida and now in several other states. The first thing you do is you go to the search bar and you want to punch in the ticker of the company. So in the case of Trulieve, it's Trul, T-R-U-L, and give it a click. So you can see here, Trulieve Cannabis Corp, and this is their landing page on the Canadian Securities Exchange. Now, these forms are a little bit tricky to find. So what you want to do is you want to scroll all the way down, and you're going to see a section called CSE Filings right here. And this is where the monthly progress reports are. You go to the CSE's website, you go to the landing page, you scroll down, and then you can click on their monthly progress reports. So this was a monthly progress report that was filed by Trulieve for April, and they filed it on May 7th, which was the deadline. It was on the Friday. And you can see here that they ask a number of questions to the company, including what's the status of the business, what's going on, what new products have you launched, et cetera, et cetera. And you can take a look at all the detail here. So this is a very fantastic form because let's take a look here. It says, describe the acquisition of new customers or loss of customers. And you can see here that Trulieve added 20,000 new patients in Florida in April. Now, Trulieve's April financial results that would cover the month of April are probably not going to be due out until August. You know, it's in Q2. So April to June, you have about several weeks to file. So you're probably not going to know that till August. But if you were thinking about those earnings in August and you were reading these monthly progress reports, you might realize, oh, wow, this company is actually gaining a lot of patients in the interim. And this is information that's not put out in a press release. This isn't information that goes on CEDAR or on EDGAR or on some of the more conventional statements we're used to seeing. So this can be a great source of information because if a company was gaining a lot of patients, losing a lot of patients, opening things up, closing things down, you might get a leading investor edge when it comes to information. So this is a fantastic resource if you're following the MSO space, and it's really easy to find.
Are there any particular drawbacks or complications with using these forms? Or are there any particular things that investors should be wary of?
So the biggest thing when it comes to drawbacks is the quality of information from company to company. So some companies will give you extraordinarily granular detail about what's going on in the business, and some of them will try and be a bit more light touch. So for example, if you look at a company like Trulieve, they'll actually show you their employment numbers every single month, who they fired, who they hired, net terminations, net resignations. You get all of that information every single month. But at the same time, there's other companies. So for example, Green Thumb, Green Thumb doesn't really do that every single month. They are much more later when it comes to employee hiring and firing details. So some companies will only put information about executives they've fired or a very, very critical key hire in the company, but they won't give you that monthly data. Thankfully, most MSOs, though, do give you that information. So TrueLeave, Curaleaf, Forefront Ventures, you can get a lot of detail on the monthly hiring and firing. Another unfortunate drawback, though, is that I did say that there was a deadline. You're supposed to file these before the 5th trading day of any month. And the big issue here is that a lot of companies can unfortunately tend to miss these. Compliance is definitely a bit of an issue. So it might be frustrating as an investor when you log in Friday morning and you say, okay, I'm going to go get this form and I'm going to get my information edge. It'll tell me about the patient numbers or tell me about the hiring or the business firing. And you find that it's not uploaded and it's missing. So it's unfortunate this does happen sometimes. Hopefully, whatever company you're investing in is filing them on time. If they're not filing them on time, I highly recommend that you poke their investor relations department and say, hey guys, this form is due and it's probably in your best interest to file it. So it's usually boils down to some companies are very granular, some are less granular, and then sometimes companies can screw up and not file the form on time, in which case, like I said, just give them a bug.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us on the show today, Michael.
Yeah, it was great to be here.
And for our viewers at home, we'll see you next time. But in the meantime, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.